Yes.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. Wait. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's be clear what do negative prefer and what is exactly our burden. We prefer this country just does not have to pay for the players that actually plays within their nation to the country that they already origin from. What is exactly our burden? Our burden is to prove to you why, number one, the action of like paying is actually not justifiable. I want to note that on their side of the house, they haven't actually proven why this policy is actually principally justified. But number two, why exactly it actually creates more harm than goods, and therefore it should not be proposed in the first place. But for that, I would just want to question what exactly the context of like why do people like how exactly like those players are able to actually get to a different country to play for them in the first place. I think there are three layers to this. Number one, it looks like a naturalization that happens. So when a player comes to that country and decided to naturalize within that country, you're able to actually play for that country's national for the national team in terms of like the international competitions such as Olympic, such as FIFA. It looks like the Lucas Podolski who are able to actually migrate to Germany at the point of like they're able he able to actually naturalize within Germany. Secondly, it looks like when a player who actually decided to migrate early on from their life, that is to say that when they were young, they were migrated into a different country, and at that point, they're able to actually stay within that country and able to play for that country's national team. Thirdly, is when a player who actually holds two national teams, and we see this happen when Declan Rice decided to actually like when he actually has two nationality, which is Ireland and also England, decided to actually sign the allegiance towards the England instead of like Ireland, even though he's actually from Ireland. I think in these three situations is how exactly players are able to actually move to that country. Context out of the way, let's just rebut a couple of things coming from that side of the house. The first thing I'm gonna there will be three things in my speech. Firstly, I'm gonna explain to you why exactly is principally not justified for you to actually pay this money. Secondly, what exactly the harms of like the development of the country at the point where it decided to actually enforce this like country to pay for them. And finally, why exactly is harmful if you're trying to actually create a form of deterrence, which dealt with the argument coming from like the at the end of like the first speaker before me speech. Firstly, then, on the principle of that reparation, rebuttal will be integrated. The first thing I'm going to know is that when exactly do we actually give money to other countries at the point where there is something happen? There are situations we usually like only give money to other countries when there is a significant amount of injustices that has been caused by that country, or when there is actually a transaction that happens. Why exactly on their side of the house this does not actually fulfill this principle or this metric? The first is the fact that you are the one who actually trains the player who actually to become good in the first place, which means that you not only did not do any kind of injustices, but you also did not do any transaction whatsoever with the country, but rather with the player itself, because you're the one who actually bring the player in and to actually like help the player to actually develop. Secondly, these players are the one who actually goes into your country simply because of the fact that they notice that how exactly there's a lack of opportunity within within their own country, which is why they go into your country and to play for your country instead. Which means that there is no injustices or there's no transaction whatsoever simply because of the fact that this player consented. Thirdly, the fact that these players already assigned an allegiance to play for your national team, which means that they did not actually suffer any kind of harm whatsoever, nor there is a transaction that is happening, which means that on principle level, these three layers prove why exactly it is not actually justified for you to actually pay this money simply because of the fact that there is no necessity. They have not proven to us why exactly there is a necessity, which is why on principle level, they already lost the debate. Second argument then, why exactly it will harm the development of the country? Let's listen back what is exactly the goal of the affirmative. The goal of the affirmative is actually to gain money. I would suggest to you that in this country, if your main goal actually to gain money, it will actually harm the country even more. What they suggested on their side of the house, they suggested that this developing country does not have actual enough goods infrastructure to begin with to actually like develop those players, and which is why like those players move to different countries to begin with. Why is this important? The first thing I'm going to know to you is to question why exactly this country doesn't have a good infrastructure. I would suggest to you there are two levels to this. Number one, it's because there are probably a lot of corruption that exists within like the sport ministry to begin with, which means that there are a lot of like the resources that has been allocated to like the necessary part of like the sport development has not actually been used to actually develop the country's infrastructure. Or two, there is a lack of prioritization that exists within the country itself, which means that a lot of time the sport development within that country are not being prioritized. They're prioritizing other things. What does this mean? It means that even if they prove to us that they get money on their side of the house, this money will never actually go into developing the sport industry within the country, simply because of the fact that there is no incentive for them to actually build the country even further. But then the question becomes, who exactly will get the money? I would suggest to you that it will get into those people who they are considered already like not developing the good infrastructure to begin with. What is the problem if they get all of this money? Because now they see there is no longer incentive for them to build a strong national team, but instead see this as an opportunity to actually sell all of those players to make a lot of profit. This is a problematic for two reasons. Number one, it's the fact that at the point where they see there is no reason for them to actually develop this player anymore, they can just send off all those players. Now you are literally weakening your own team and your own national team, simply because of the fact that you see that you are able to actually send all of those players into overseas to get a lot of money, because this is like some form of like investment that you try to do. But number two, you literally like forcing this player to actually like play for different national teams simply because of the fact that they might not actually agree to play in different countries, but the fact that you are literally like forcing them to go to different countries because you are trying to sell them off. And this is what like the first affirmative suggests to us, where like a lot of countries will actually invest in terms of like buying the players from different countries, which is why we think that it's going to be very harmful because of the fact that you are forcing them. But I also want to know why exactly development doesn't actually happen in their side on their side of the house. The fact is, because they know that the investment that they have to put into like developing this player is actually doesn't equate to the cost of, to the profit of like them actually selling off those players. What I mean by that, it will be much better for them to actually not doing anything and know that they will get a lot of money, because players who actually become good, goes to different country, are able to actually gain more money, which means that they're not going to actually like develop those players to begin with. The conclusion to this argument is that there is no guarantee that they will actually like improve the development of like the sports within the country, but we suggest to you it will harm the national teams and the development of the country even further, simply because of the fact that you continuously forcing all of those players and selling all of your players on their side of the house. Last argument then, why exactly it will be harmful even if this is the form of deterrence? Because they suggest on their side of the house that at the point where where like nobody actually buy the player from you, that means that you are able to actually keep your player. But I think like what this argument also tries to imply is that this, because like the amount of money that you will probably want to set, probably going to be high for you to create this some form of deterrence, so you can keep all of those players within your nation, right? Why is this a problematic thing? Because I want to suggest to you that at the point where you decided to create it as a form of deterrence, there will be no team or no countries who are actually going to like invest in the players within your country. I want to note to you the reasons why other like a very developed sport institution or sport countries with a very developed sport industry goes into a different country simply because of the fact that they want to find a better player and they want to develop those players. But if they know that all of those players they have to actually pay back at the point where they already train all those players, they will not see any benefit whatsoever in terms of their investment. What are the harms here? Because those players are not able to migrate to different countries. 3 layers to this. The first one is because of like the development of the sport development of the country is very harmful, which means there is no ability for those players to actually improve their skills. This is harmful for the development of the player itself because they're not able to become a better player in the future. Secondly, they do not like the team itself because of the fact that they're probably going to stay within those countries. They're going to harm the dynamic of the country, which harms the ability for the national team to win. And finally, they remove the ability for them to actually move to a different country, which means that they no have ability to actually compete anymore, simply because of the fact that maybe they're not able to get selected within the country. All of these things harms the player. The comparative on our side of the house, we give all of those players a chance to play without all of these things. For those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I call upon the second speaker from side affirmative.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Sports not only create a culture, they also affect cultures. But first, let me proceed to my responses or rebuttals to the opposition. First is that they said that the fact that these nations are the one who train the athlete, then it doesn't make sense that they will compensate the country of origin. However, this is not always the case because there are players who have been trained well in their own countries for years. However, because wealthier countries have better offers, these players would grab that opportunity. But on the latter part of my speech, I will explain to you how this will less likely happen on our side. Next is that they said that our policy is harmful because these countries are then trying to sell off these players. Well, in the status quo, they are losing these great players because they are not able to compensate them better than those countries who outsource. However, on our side, these countries will get the funding that will allow them to have sports development that will prevent this from happening again. They also said that there's no assurance that this money would go to the development of sports. However, we already explained to you why they would want to increase or invest in systems, because they want as much players to be picked or outsourced. So even if there's for example, corruption, they understand that the way they can get the money is through increasing more sports investment or talent in their country. So the incentive to like develop their sports is there. Next is that they said that they would only give money to other countries where there is a transaction or whatsoever. But that's just not true because they do not prove that this is the case. Sometimes countries lend other countries money. So even if there is still transaction anyways, because these bigger countries are getting good players, which they would want to get the best players because they would most likely only outsource those players because they're really good. Now, what really is the issue of this debate? I think that in this debate, the issue is where are we able to have like a fairer situation among all stakeholders? I believe that on our side, first, we're able to provide people in third world countries with more opportunities because a lot of athletes outsources come from usually are from third world countries who genuinely have the passion to play. For example, Messi, who is from Argentina, is basically a country hero because of how he defied the odds or how he was able to become a world-class superstar by playing. But even if they are not from developing nations, people who probably feel the effects the most are these clusters of countries. Obviously, if you are from America, you would not feel the effects of this, and so as far as this money is more likely to matter to countries that really, really need it, in this case, developing nations, then it's important to note that a lot of people in these countries have little alternatives. If you're in a developing country and you're struggling, you have very little options to potentially align with your own interests. Just because you are from a third world country does not mean you cannot self-actualize or get a job that you don't like. So by investing in this, because you know that you might get compensated back, you provide more individuals with alternative choices instead of like working a blue collar job, etc. So providing them with more opportunities means more jobs for people. But sports is also considered as a hobby than more of it as a job. However, with our policy, it legitimizes it in their own country and makes it easier for them to really chase their passions. Our policy also allows them to self-actualize and not restrict themselves to just jobs that have been traditionally earned, but also invest in their hobbies and invest in something a lot of people are incredibly passionate about. It also changes the way society sees sports and legitimizes it as an actual job instead of just a hobby. Next is that it also allows for more representation for minorities. This incentivizes larger countries that play on a big scale to represent minorities and give them an opportunity to talk about their country. For example, if I am from Laos and I get play on the international level, I can shed light on what happens in my country. For example, if there are civil wars and other societal issues. So this only happens when these developing countries who often have other priorities will invest in their sports program because they recognize that you get more money from it. Overall, representation is just a good thing, and this allows for a more diverse set of sports players. Third is that on our side of the bench, developing nations get more resources that helps them to be on par with dominating countries. So in the current status of the international sports community, these are heavily dominated by players from more wealthy nations, which is harmful in general because there is a lack of opportunities of the teams of other countries, of other cultures, that are capable to be on their level, but are not able to do so since they lack the funds. Because of this, they are not able to develop or improve their current national teams, which hinders them from being seen or compete well on the international level. Furthermore, they're even at a more disadvantage because these wealthy nations generally have more funds, so they are able to give better offers to great players coming from less developed nations to represent for them. So, like sports is where people from all around the world, from all different walks of life, can still come together, right? So we would want other countries, particularly those who are at a disadvantage, in this case, the developing nations, to also have the chance to be on the center stage. And they can only have that when they have enough funds, which you can get on our side. So when a team is required to pay compensation to their nation of origin, we are able to gather more funds to the local sports team, which means that they get the resources to boost or hone their skills, the skills of their players, which helps them become competitive enough to take part in international sports events. In this way, we are able to have more representation in the field of sports, more representation of these less developing nations. Despite wealthy nations having players from other countries, it is still a win-win for everyone at the end of the day because developing nations get compensated for this. And in the long run, if their sports team are already competitive enough because they already have the resources coming from this policy that we are trying to push, then they are able to have less players that need to go to another country, which was related to my second argument about how our policy help provide people in third world countries with more opportunities. Moreover, champions make their mark upon the history of their culture. For example, Jackie Robinson, the first Black athlete to play in Major League Baseball, opened the floodgates to non-racial sports. So when people are able to be given with the opportunity to play at the international level, it promotes inclusivity and promotion of diverse cultures across the globe. And we can only get that when we impose the policy of giving funds to these developing nations for them to be competitive enough. So after all, sporting events around the world generally aim to bring nations together, right? To unify as one, all supporting and cheering a common love, interest, and goal. So on our side, developing nations are not robbed off of their good players. Instead, they are provided with opportunities that help them get better representation worldwide since they're able to gather the funds to further improve their sports development. And that we're proud to affirm.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I call upon the second speaker from side negative.
All right. Great. Hopefully I'm audible.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Pronouns are he, him. Okay. On both sides of the house, there is an option for good players to be naturalized into the other nation that they choose. And this happens quite regularly in Europe, where like Thiago, who played for Brazil or who is a Brazil national, wants to play for the Spanish national team because he feels that he identifies with the Spanish national team. Lucas Podolski, who played for Poland, feels as if he wants to play for the German national team. Therefore, he does go on to play for the German national team. De Paulas, who wants to play for Malaysia even though he was born in Brazil. All these things mean that these players have the option to play for the national team if they wanted to or if they were invited, which means Gov has a question to answer. Are they okay with naturalization or do they want to ban naturalization altogether? Because as they argue that it's so bad for you to play for another national team because it has harms to the national representation and harms the legitimacy of that particular job. So are you then going to go the extra mile and say that, like banning naturalization? which means that all benefits that they argue are contingent on these players staying, while in status quo, there is already an option for them to leave anyway. Your policy doesn't guarantee them to stay regardless, which means that their mechanization is unclear and dubious. But I would argue on a comparative that the people who wanted to stay would have probably stayed anyway. And there are a lot of other good examples for this as well. Salah, who played like English football in Liverpool, still wants to play for Egypt, even though Egypt doesn't do particularly well in the national frontier. Riyad Mahrez, who plays a lot in English football, also doesn't feel as if he wants to play for England because he does want to still play for the Algerian national team. This means that it's very, very different and quite individual as to what kind of, or like which, like who these individuals want to play for anyway, which means that like all of their benefits are quite contingent on this assumption that they will stay. The second thing I'd like to say is on like there is just no principal defense to what we argued in first, because they haven't proven why there is a need to compensate. So even if we buy that they will stay in every single circumstance because of even if we buy and we're very charitable to buying your development argument, there is no principal need for this, which means that this policy is immoral. Because we argued you the only circumstances where you can compensate individuals is when there is a transaction or when there is injustice. Unfortunately, it's injustice to keep them trapped into these countries to begin with, because they don't identify with that country anymore. They don't want to play for that country anymore. That's why they sign their allegiance to another country and wants to play for the other country. Therefore, the gov has to like draw the line as to where exactly are they okay with naturalization. First, clarification I'd like to make before moving on to two claims on like how we get better improvement of facilities or gov doesn't achieve that, and secondly, how you marginalize the players way more. Firstly, on Western imposition, because they assume that all the good players go to the West and all the developing nations are left there to suffer. There is an assumption here that the West poaches all of the good players, which I think is categorically untrue, because a lot of Western players don't feel appreciated in the West as well, which is why they go elsewhere. And it's probably because they aren't qualified enough to go to the national team. That's why they seek opportunities on the national frontier elsewhere, which is exactly why a lot of Western players come to developing nations to play for the developing nation, because that gives them a better ability for the national team. Secondly, I think a lot of Western players also go to the West as well, which means that it doesn't really have any effect on the developing nation. But this proves it mitigates the claim of Gov that suggests that there is a huge Western imposition, because I don't think it is. But secondly, just because you go elsewhere, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteed that spot in that national team, because playing at the national level is quite difficult. The barrier of entry is very high, which is exactly why a lot of players don't opt to do this anyway, and they play for their own national team, even like they play for the national team because it's quite difficult to play well for another country. This proves that it's uncertain that they will go to the Western nation, because a lot of times they stay for other reasons. It minimizes the scale of harm if there was any. First issue then, on improvement of facilities. We argued you in first how states itself do not want to invest in their own countries, and they prioritize other sectors as opposed to their sports team, and at worst they engage in corruption. What this proves is that there is an incentive that exists that does not want to invest into their own grassroots, regardless of if there is policy or not. Let's analyze what happens when there is this policy. Given that this is an incentive that wasn't taken down by affirmative, we prove what happens here is that these states will view these good players that exist in the grassroots as cash cows. What are the harms of this? Because if it is true that they are deterred from playing elsewhere, this is what happens. Number one, players see that all their good players are being sold off abroad because the state wants compensation. This means there is no reason to play for the national team, because all those good players are going elsewhere anyway. There is no motivation to play for the national team, but rather there's a motivation to play for another developed nation in the West, perhaps. But secondly, all good players leave, which means that it's likely that your national team is gonna suck, right? Which means that the grassroots don't have any incentive to play for a national team that doesn't have enough accolades, that doesn't have any achievements. But this proves that it's unlikely that they will improve the facilities, and even if they do improve the facilities, these players don't want to commit to the national team anyway. Second issue on how it marginalizes players. The only thing affirmative talks about is how there is going to be natural representation. We already argued how this assumes that they will 100% get these players to stay no matter what, which we argue if they wanted to, they would have left anyway. This debate is about this debate is about whether it is whether the compensation is justified or not. But we'll take them at their best. Okay, there is deterrence for these players to leave. Therefore, all the good players will stay within these developing nations. What are the harms to this? It marginalizes the player because these players will never get the opportunities that they obviously deserve. Their livelihoods are dependent on the ability for them to perform on the highest level, but they're deterred from doing that. And this is basically coercion. This means that they're never going to be able to play for the World Cup because their team doesn't qualify for the World Cup, while the other team that they are qualified for has the ability to play, but they're unable to play. This harms their livelihood. But secondly, it also deters them from identifying with what they truly want to identify with. Because lots of people go to the West because they identify with the culture of the West, or identify with other reasons because they care about the money, or whatever reasons it may be. We think that individuals have the ability or deserve that right to decide their own fate, as opposed to them being coerced into deciding what kinds of identity they believe in. The harm to this here, in natural representation and dealing with that, is that if they are trapped within these developing nations, then they wouldn't feel like they want to play for that national team because they are robbed away of their identity. Because they want to sign their allegiance to Germany, but in Malaysia, the players are not that good. Therefore, they're probably not going to do as well in Malaysia. But secondly, maybe they'll just have disagreements continuously, or they don't even want to try out for the national team, specifically because they'll think that they will always lose. Therefore, there is no motivation to do better anyway. This proves that this policy is actually counterproductive to national representation. Because national representation relies on the metric that they want to play for the national team, and they're doing it well. If we have successfully proven that trapping them in this nation does not fulfill that and make that goal successful, then we obviously win on all fronts.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and now I call upon the third speaker from side affirmative.
Hi, can I be heard well?
Yeah.
Awesome. If I disconnect, just let any of my team members know. Yeah, my pronouns are she, her. I'll be the whip. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Sports has always been an important aspect, an important part of culture for a lot of different countries. And I think in countries where there is low morale, or in places where you do not win a lot, there is a higher incentive to care about these types of sports, insofar as you want to see that type of representation and you want to see that kind of pride that you have in your country. For example, in the Philippines, we got our first gold medal ever in the last Olympics, and it was a really big deal for a lot of people. And it just shows that sports is incredibly intertwined with culture. And so in this debate, I just want to talk about the values and the non-values that were talked about, and why I think overall we as affirmative should win this. First of all, let's talk about the non-values in this debate. 4 main things. Firstly, how they talk about how corruption exists in these countries. I think to a certain extent that is true. But I think if there is an international exchange that costs money, that costs capital, that is at somebody's expense, the people who are paying, for example, the citizens, because the assumption is the government is paying and these are taxes, probably want to call them out if they were to go out and just be corrupt, because to an extent it is their money. I think if corruption does exist and these exchanges are done on an international level, you are less incentivized to use that money, specifically because the world is watching. For example, every win of X player from Z country will tie back to that transaction, and if people do enough digging, they'll find that you're corrupt in that limelight, right? So if I was the president of my country and I give off this player, or this player is moving to Germany or something, and then they pay us, and then I suddenly buy a Lamborghini, it'll definitely raise some eyebrows and you will be less incentivized to want to do it. But I think even more so because it is an international level, assuming that these people are power hungry, we'd even go so far to say that it would disincentivize them to want to be corrupt, insofar as people can easily look back on this, but also just because you don't want that to be your background when people think about that country or stuff like that. And so I think it is less likely that they will want to be corruption in these instances. And if they are, I feel like there are safety nets in their own country that will probably like stop that from happening, or like protesting against that from happening already. But second, we want to talk about how this is a transaction, because they keep pushing this narrative that we are like human trafficking them to another country, or like moving them to another country against their will. Like, this is obviously a transaction. So when people are interested in something, they say that they are interested in that player, they like pay off, like they buy quote unquote that player off of that country because they have that skill, and that skill was invested from by that country, which is what my first speaker was talking about a while ago. You are purchasing someone, a skill and a person to represent you. In the same way, you purchase a lawyer, or you pay for the services of a lawyer because they have accumulated skills over the years so that you can win that court case. It's the same thing. It's not like this out of the world narrative that like suddenly has never happened before. But third, on the non-values of debate, about this weird naturalization case and how we just never want these people to leave their country or something like that. I think if these countries want them so bad, then they have to recognize that this is an investment in that part. And if they need to be neutralized, then that's fine. Like, I don't understand how we're suddenly stopping them from potentially moving to this other country. If they want to, then they can. Just because you get naturalized does not inherently mean either that you aren't born in the country you originated from. So if I am from the Philippines and I move to Canada, I am still by origin and ethnicity a Filipino. I'm not suddenly going to turn into a white person from Canada or something like that. That is obviously what is being referred to, and there's no confusion there. So I don't understand this whole case of naturalization. But then they try to say something like, and my first speaker was able to talk about this payment, and like, it isn't like we're paying them forever or anything. Like, this is just some sort of exchange between these two countries. But then Negative tries to make an absurd claim that we are forcing them into this in the first place. I think if you are somebody who is not well off and this looks unattractive, or like these types of like offers are obviously look attractive. If they don't, then we invented in other members who may want to play nationally and like want to do stuff like that. But I think if the priority of the country is to not have a strong national team, but to have that representation in other places and gain that capital, that's perfectly fine. That's a trade-off the country has to be willing to make in themselves. Like, this is a non-issue and a risk countries themselves from themselves. If they think that you'll get more money winning the championship and investing in their national team, then that's something they'll invest in. If they think that they will make more capital in offering these athletes to other people by still providing them these services and the opportunities, then we still think that's perfectly fine. Like, this is a non-issue. And the way this works is just, this is an extra step. Like, this is not some kind of trap to keep them, the way that like opposition is trying to say this whole time, right? And so then what are the main values of debate? I think first of all, we want to talk about why this is principally justified, which again came out from like our first speaker. I think the resources used to develop that player comes from the country itself. May it be culture that they cultivate, the courts they use, and the coaches that they use. Like, when you go to college, like, you pay for college because you want to use the resources there, you want to learn there, and you obviously want to like have that educational exchange. And that's the same thing in the country. I think even if they become naturalized and move to Japan or whatever, the reason they are good in the first place is because of that country. Maybe they push them to or not. The resources were there, they came from there, or like the resources that they used came from there, and like the people who were helping them also came from there. But I think even if it wasn't the government directly investing in them, investing into them, I think this is still like taxpayers' money, and so the people who did help them probably still get like the trickle down of like whatever happened or whatever like infrastructures they decide to build due to that. But I think this isn't even like that different from these countries using these players as like tourism, or using them as like brands, or being super duper proud of them, like Messi from Argentina and stuff like that, right? Like, this is just like the same thing on it. I just think that it is like more official, quote unquote. But then I also want to talk about, where are these countries better off in the first place, right? I think if these countries are already investing into the sports program and are considered to be rich countries, this is on net the same expense. For example, if I'm the USA and I have X amount of fund for sports, if this is a really big deal for me, then I will be willing to spend that amount of money. And when you do get these countries, and when you do, you get these countries to create more athletes, right? The countries that they are buying from. I think even if they end up not wanting to make their own quote unquote national team composed of their own nationals, like I said earlier, that's a risk they ought to make. They ought to be willing to take, and a decision they inherently have to make for that country alone. Like, I don't understand why like this is suddenly such a really, really big issue when this is something that countries have to decide for themselves. I'd even go so far to say that nationalism, which is a value we brought up and is widely important, just don't like matter as much for these larger countries, because they can't find it in other spaces, because they can find it in other spaces. For example, like China and UK being represented in, or like winning the Olympics, is not as much of a big deal for like these developing nations who are less likely to have that representation in the first place. So I think on net, there's really not that big of a harm when these people or these countries are purchasing off them. But I think there's no loss for people who are investing in the trade-off of them not getting their own sports or their own sports people is a risk they ought to be willing to take. But they probably won't, because I think like they can decide if it's cheaper or not for themselves. But now really quickly on the last like really important status. So when there is this type of transaction, which was talked about like by my second speaker, it means that bigger countries are like less likely to be pushed over by these smaller countries, or like they have like more power in terms of like these types of sports and this soft diplomacy that my first speaker was talking about. Like if you're the main source of football players from a third world country, when it comes to international policies or like debates or stuff like that they talked about earlier, I think they're less incentivized to speak over you or take advantage of you simply because they want to keep that exchange. I think this is the soft diplomacy that my first speaker mentioned, and it was incredibly important. But also where my second speaker talked about more representation. I think this is the only way that it happens, and I think the only way that like these countries are able to like build themselves up and actually like fight in the like international tournaments and stuff like that. I think this gives them that opportunity or leverage to a certain extent. So it proved to you why principally this is necessary. I think secondly, why on net these bigger countries probably don't care or probably like aren't breaking the bank by buying these investments. And third, why it will end up overall better for these like developing countries who are majority of the time where these like not where a majority of these types of exchanges matter. So with that, I am proud to propose. Thank you.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I call upon the third speaker of side negative.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, give me a second. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The dynamic shift in language in terms of what this debate really is about that came on WIP just shows to prove how affirmative only realized that they also have to defend naturalization. So this debate is no longer about soft power. This debate is no longer about just national pride, because on both sides, this place would still go to the other countries. The question now just narrows down to whether the origin country deserves to get that form of compensation. But also, it's more than just about transactions as between lawyers and clients, as mentioned by WIP speaker, right? Because in that case, you pay the lawyers for your services, but in this case, you don't pay the players, you pay the country. So the degree of just the compensation itself is already different. We say that to this extent, we just respect the autonomy from these players and want to make sure that the players will get the best deal when it comes to just applying for this naturalization with other countries. 2 things I'll do in my speech. I'll give a rebuttal from the speaker before me. And second thing I'll do is just give 2 issues. Firstly, is it true that affirmative will get development? And secondly, did affirmative principally justify the compensation? And I'll do my weighings at the end of the speech. Let's take a look at the rebuttals first and foremost. The way they mitigate corruption is by saying that it's because this is now a transaction between 2 countries in an international level, then there's less propensity for like corruptions to happen in the first place. I would argue to you it's totally different. First and foremost, when you do receive compensation by the new country is never going to facilitate how the origin country ought to use the money, because they don't have any rights over them, because they've already paid the money, and also because it's not imperialism as mentioned by them. So therefore, corruption can still happen on their ground. But also secondly, I would argue to you that sports in the international level itself has already been corrupted for the longest time. Take a look at Qatar World Cup, for example, right? There are some forms of corruption when it comes to just building those stadiums. Or just take a look at the football league in terms of this Super League, right? On how like a lot of these massive football club owners are just corrupted because they want to profit off of making a league entirely from just playing football. So I would argue to you that corruption is going to happen, regardless if it's international or local, but it's going to exacerbate even further when you do make this compensation as a form of method for every single transaction of naturalization that has happened. Let's move on to my first issue then, on is it true that affirmative will get development? The main contention that came from their side is that when these origin countries do receive fundings, then they have some form of incentive to actually invest in their sports in the first place. But the main question is the fact that, for example, and this is just hypothetical, if Messi were to be Argentinian and he's like the best football player ever, and then he decides to naturalize to, I don't know, maybe Germany, wouldn't that itself be a good incentive, knowing that your player is already good enough and they came from your origin country? Why wouldn't the origin country want to invest in sports even more, right? The reason why we question this is because, firstly, why do you want to shift responsibility? But secondly, notice how they did not deal with the case coming from my LO speech on two reasons why infrastructure within its origin countries are bad. Firstly, it's because of the corruptions, but also secondly, because of the lack of prioritization that actually happens in the first place. So if you were to concede that these countries just don't care about these players, and then now when they get the money, they suddenly want to care about these players, then is this not true? But even if it were to happen, I'll prove to you later why it's bad. But the second problem here is that they also did not deal with my LO's analysis on the countries, how countries would sell off these players, right? First and foremost, the reason why we contend this is because with affirmative whip already concedes that this is just a transaction. So this further proves how these origin countries would likely sell their players off when they actually get good. But also secondly, you now force players to play overseas, and the lack of development is going to trickle down to the national team, because now all your good players are in the new country and they're naturalized and settling there. Now the development squad on your own country is going to be one that is not good at all. All of this is because under the assumption that there's going to be goodwill when it comes to just prioritizing the funds for the national good team, right? But even if, let's say, for example, there weren't any forms of corruption at all, I think the fact still remains that the fact that you have some form of incentive to actually sell off more of your players, precisely because the characterization is this is a developing nation with really bad infrastructure, then they're more likely to sell their players off. Meaning, the only benefit that they can get is going to be in the long term when they actually have a well-established. But in the short term, a lot of players are actually going to be harmed by this policy in terms where they just have no ability to even play for their own countries or just forced to play for other countries, right? What we can find under this issue is that it becomes a deterrence for other players to actually receive good skills when it comes to just playing sports, right? Because countries would now then narrow down to the only top players. This is precisely because probably countries also don't want to spend a lot of money and just cut down costs. They only have to pick the only top good players within these developing countries. Meaning to say, if there were any form of potential for other players within these developing countries to actually go into these new countries in the first place, you're going to diminish the opportunity for them, which deprives them from actually playing football in the international level. But also, the affirmative's best case, where the players actually get good in their own local grounds, right? The fact of the matter is, some players just don't reciprocate well to the developing nation, the national nations that they are right now originally. If countries were to bar them from if countries do not want to actually buy them in the first place, then they have lesser incentive to actually play for their own country, meaning you're actually depriving your own players from having the opportunity to play good in terms of football. Because football is not just about representing your own country, it's also about doing your own passion for your own benefit. Moving on to my second issue then, on did affirmative principally justify the compensation? To note here from affirmative speech. And this first one is how they said it in a rebuttal coming from the second affirmative speaker on just saying that how these players develop in their own origin country, that's why it's justified. And the second justification coming with by saying that it's as if that you actually buy these players on their own, right? One problem here is that it's not true at all. First and foremost, most naturalized players got better in their own country. If, for example, that the origin country already have adequate infrastructures in the first place, then you wouldn't want to leave in the first place, right? Because we're talking about naturalization, the process of just changing your nationality. Not only is it a big commitment, you also have to sacrifice a lot of your ties within your own country because you have to live in a new country. It's not the same as playing an international club where you still remain your own citizenship, which is talking about changing your own entire identity of your citizenship to a new one. So we say this shift of a commitment just shows to prove how a lot of players actually develop better when we go to the new countries at the end of the day. What do we then contend on this issue? We gave you two metrics to explain why it isn't principally justified for us to compensate this for developing nations, origin nations to just get compensation. The first one is the severe significant injustices. We say this doesn't happen in this transaction because players go on to these new countries on their own accord and they aren't being coerced by these new countries to join them in the first place. But also secondly, the transaction that only exists within the origin country and the players themselves. Therefore, they fail to just give you the principal justification for such compensations in the first place. Let's take a look at the weighing, right? First and foremost, in terms of the welfare of the players. I think we've already sufficiently proved to you why the welfare of players is going to deteriorate even more, precisely because of corruption, but also precisely because now the country only wants to focus on just developing their own infrastructures. This is going to ensure that a lot of players don't have the opportunities to play in the first place, which further deprives their opportunity to actually play in an international level that's going to be good for them. But also in regards to just the welfare of the teams, I think most likely what's going to happen to the national team is going to deteriorate even further, precisely because you have a business model for these countries to actually just profit off in the first place. If you want to make sure that your players are good, you have to believe in them. Thank you.
Amazing. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I'll reverse the order. So I call upon the leader of the negative team to give their reply speech.
I'm second neg, so not yeah. I have two observations, and then I'll go on to the bigger picture. And I think the observations will make it clear that we've been listening. Firstly, they assume that this is exactly like a transaction. But is this transaction even justified? Which means that they have to prove why there is an acquisition of skills and how that skill is being sold and that transaction is inherently justified. We argued that these origin players never owned these players to begin with because they acquired these skills abroad, which means that they played in the France academy. Therefore, by logic, their rights should have been given to the France academy. But why all of a sudden are we paying Ghana for a Kante? Which means that the logic that affirmative argues, which is that it's just like paying for a lawyer in skills, isn't really true. It's as if you're paying the lawyer's past employer for just employing them in the past. Like, it's literally not the same. But secondly, I think this was a strategic flaw in the affirmative team when they said that when they equated this to a transaction. Because now it qualifies our argument that there is now an incentive for these states to go off and sell these players every single time there is a good one. The harms are, firstly, players see that good players are constantly being sold off because it's a business, as they say, which means that they wouldn't even want to try out for the national team because the national team will always just sell you off elsewhere. But secondly, all good players leave. That means the team sucks. They don't win anything. There's also no motivation. But thirdly, even if in the absolute best case, it's a cash cow, you get a lot of money, they never really contested with our characterization that FIFA is corrupt, a lot of developing nations are corrupt, therefore they just swindle the money anyway, or they'll never even give it to the grassroots and trickle-down benefits don't manifest, which means that if with or without the principal clash, we already win, notwithstanding the fact that they never really properly dismantle our argument in first. First issue on how it's unfair for players. We argued that in the absolute best case on affirmative, it will deter the good players from leaving because the state wants them to bring national pride. And this is the rhetoric that came from every single speech in F. The harms are that they feel trapped because they never really wanted to play for the national team anyway, because they feel as if the national team doesn't appreciate them, doesn't give them equal opportunities. They don't feel as if the culture really is with them and they feel that they identify with someone else. And this happens in the past. And why is this different? The harm that is that now you're not going to feel motivated. There is a lack of morale within the national team. Therefore, it's incredibly counterproductive to the goal of national pride. Then if people found out that these players never really wanted to play for the national team, then it would have an opposite reaction to how national pride will then be diminished. But secondly, if you're good, you're going to take someone else's spot because now you're going to be perceived as good and now you're playing for the national team, but you never wanted to play for the national team. So other people in your country are now going to be disenfranchised and not going to be given opportunities. That's also a harm that exists for everyone, exacerbated and multiplied by the harm of how you have a player that doesn't want to play, but is now currently playing. Which means that we've proved, and the reason why this is important is because these players playing well is a roadmap to getting national pride. Insofar as they're not playing well, they will not get national pride. We get that better, or at least we don't maximize the harms. The bigger picture in this debate here is that there are players who want to leave the country in search for better opportunities elsewhere. And then there are players who don't want to leave. This debate assumes that the players who want to leave would have left anyway. Now you make it a price tag. So now they can't leave because other countries don't want to buy them and they have to be forced to play for their current national team. That means that the quality of sports when either country loses out, but these players don't even get to play what they want. Given that everything is equal, at the very least, it's fair, or it's only just and fair to give these players better access to opportunities for all those reasons.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I call upon the leader of the affirmative team to give their reply speech.
Hello. Okay, wait. Starting my speech in okay. Starting my speech in 3. Oh yeah, please. So sorry. Recording.
I don't have any general feedback, but feel free to come to either me or the panelists for any questions and personal feedback. And anything that isn't mentioned in my adjudication is something I didn't think was determinative in this debate. And if you have any further questions on some of the other clashes that aren't discussed or any material that is not in my adjudication, feel free to ask that as well. So position and then the reason for the decision. The debate was unanimous, but a close debate. For me, it was pretty close. And in the end, on unanimous decision, we gave the debate to the affirmative team. So congratulations to DLSU Manilla, commiserations, Ujimara. The reason for that is as follows. I'm going to divide this up into the principal justification clash, and I just want to highlight some things about the principal arguments used, and secondly, about the impacts to, I guess, sports in the origin nation and players and the outcomes for those players. So firstly, on the principal justification, we hear very strongly from side negative that there is no principal urgency, no principal reason to do this, and they give some criteria for just compensation in instances where there is some injustice that's happened that requires that compensation. Side affirming says, well, you have this investment that's happened in the origin country, and therefore that is a reason why there might be a justified compensation or a principal reason to have that compensation. I think side negative correctly points out that this debate is broader than some of the poaching aspects that were brought up by side affirmative, and sometimes it's not always the case or not always provable to a large extent that a large amount of that investment came from the origin country. But what that means then is that there's no principal urgency from side affirming to do this. And the important thing I want to highlight here, that it doesn't necessarily mean, as claimed by side negative, that any burden of transaction or a burden of compensation on the new nation that hosts this athlete is principally unjust. It just means that there is no principal urgency to do that in the framing given to us by side negative. Maybe there's an implicit assumption, like some sort of reverse Rawlsian theory, that anything that isn't principally mandated is unjust, but I don't think that argumentation is ever explicitly made, and I think that requires a lot of I guess, explanation if that argument is intended to be made. So which means that there is no principal urgency that lets affirmative win this debate on a principle, but I don't think that necessarily means that side negative proves that there is a massive principal harm from putting on additional compensation. Obviously, that means that the debate comes out of outcomes. So if affirmative or negative can show that there is harms or benefits that come from imposing this compensation, then the debate will turn on those outcomes. I want to note here that outcomes to players and the fairness aspect of the opportunities and human flourishing and hobbies and all that kind of thing is impacts on outcomes that aren't necessarily tied to the principle of whether that transaction in and of itself is justified or not. So that leads me down to my second clash on the outcomes to players and the outcomes to sports and all of that. And I think that there is discussion about national identity and about pride, but largely the actor that is, I guess, most talked about, but also I think the clearest grounding of an impact are the players and the different ways that they're able to, or just in general, lots of levels of players and the way they're able to, I guess, fulfill their, flourishing and the fact that they want to play sports and who is able to help them the most. We hear from side affirming that there is a problem in the status quo where certain countries, mostly developing countries, aren't prioritizing sport, they don't invest in sport. So therefore, a lot of individuals in that country who do care about sports to a certain extent and do look at other sporting leagues and other teams that have their own players playing in, and they care a lot about sports regardless of that, don't have the opportunity to play in that sport. Side negative, I think, correctly points out that this lack of development comes from an incentive problem, that there's corruption, that sports is a low priority, and so therefore there's not necessarily any incentive, even if they get money from that compensation. But I think this misses the point from side affirming a little bit, because side affirming's point isn't necessarily that the money is the tipping point for capacity to invest in sports, but side affirming, I think, clearly down the line shows that money actually provides the incentive to do so. And that's for a couple of reasons. So firstly, they say that the money that comes from this is different from the current incentives of soft power, something that side negative brings up as a potential reason why that incentive would exist. I think the corruption mechanism and the lack of priority of sports in and of itself, I think, enhances the argument from side affirming that this financial incentive is actually far greater than the status quo incentives, which means that they're likely to want to maximize that level of profit. And I think that is a very clear argumentation brought from side affirming that is very intuitive and believable. What that then means is that even though they don't want to necessarily spend on sports in the abstract or without this incentive, now that there's money to be made from it, they are more likely than the status quo on side negative side to invest in grassroots. We hear mitigation from side negative that I think goes quite a long way and narrows this debate quite a bit, which is that there are multiple ways that could plausibly eventuate, where they don't necessarily focus on grassroots, but they focus only on the top players. And that argumentation, I think, goes towards maybe some form of like economic gaming from the corrupt elite who are trying to make as much money out of it, but only mitigates it insofar as they do still have an incentive to try and get as many good players as possible to maximize the amount of money that they get from other countries that are willing to pay for these players. The incentives of other countries paying, I'll get into in a little bit. The other responses from side negative, I think, are slightly uncomparative. So, for example, the fact that, oh, now you're going to have like, you're going to perceive these individuals as cash cows, all the good players are going to leave, seems to be, under both sides' characterization, what the status quo is like when a lot of people leave. There's argumentation from side negative that actually is a choice, and there are many reasons why people might stay in the origin nation and only some people might leave. But the argumentation from side affirming suggests that a lot of people do live in the status quo because just there are better facilities and better opportunities that are presented from richer nations that are likely to offer these things to people. There is a secondary part of this debate, right? So it's not just the individuals that leave for the sport, but other individuals that leave for naturalization and have the ability to play on sports later on. So people that migrate at a young age and all those kinds of things. The problem for side negative in buying a lot of that in terms of an outcome is that those individuals would move either way, and it's unclear as to why this particular policy would prevent that movement in and of itself. And I'll get into whether that means that they aren't able to play sports in their new nation later on. But what this point proves to me, or in the end of this debate, side affirming is able to prove that there is a significantly comparative investment in sport and impact that to show that means there are far more people that are able to access that sport and far more people that are able to improve their talent in that sport than in the status quo, because it matches the incentives of the corrupt or the government that has low priority now has a financial incentive to do this. So that is the benefit, I think, that side affirming is able to show in this debate. What are the harms that are claimed by side negative? I feel like that there is a slight I guess, misunderstanding at certain points from side negative as to what side affirmative is trying to achieve from here. Because I think side affirmative is relatively clear right down the line that they're not concerned with preventing those athletes from leaving. And some athletes on their side will leave and you get their compensation. Their argumentation that links to the overall sport is that there will be some people that remain and more people, given that their incentives is to train a lot of people up to ensure that more people are likely to leave or to be good enough to be compensated by richer countries. The argumentation that side affirming then suggests is that then you're able to get development to create your own team. But I think that that analysis, I think, is a little bit lacking. So I'm not necessarily able to see how you get enough people, given the mitigation from side negative, to actually be successful and increase entertainment and increase competitiveness to the extent claimed by side affirmative. But they do get the benefit of more people on the grassroots level getting at least the ability to take part in that sport and all the benefits I've already discussed. So the problem there, just getting back to what side negatives claims are, is that the argument that this is now going to force people to stay or force athletes to stay is unlikely to eventuate, because there are two worlds that side negative talk about. One where these good athletes become cash cows that are forced to be sold out and they might not want it, and another world where athletes are deterred from leaving, or you're not able to go and join other sporting nations, which is also harmful for the people that want to leave. And sometimes it's really hard to see which one of these things would happen. But the bigger problem, I think, for side negative is it's unclear as to how much power these corrupt sporting leagues or corrupt governments or misprioritized governments have to force people to move or not to move. And I think largely it's up to the players to do so. So the first element in selling players and forcing them to move, and that harm that side negative brings up, the response very clearly from side affirming is that these players can just say no if they have other reasons to stay. And I think that means that what I needed from side negative is some argumentation as to how there's coercion or some element of forcing that trade just because there's money there, which means that gives credence to the idea from side affirming that if you do have more grassroots levels and training up, that some sporting athletes will choose to stay for the reasons that side negative themselves bring up. I think the stronger point for side negative is this idea that you might deter people from leaving and that limits their human flourishing. The problem with that, again, is it's unclear as to why that the act of leaving that country is solely determined on sports. For all the other categories of people that side negative talk about, such as people who want to go and naturalize for other benefits because they feel closer to the culture of a Western country, the individuals that migrate at a young age, that's likely to happen anyway. So the problem then becomes about those individuals when they become better and grow up and gain their talents from the new nation, they still have to be compensated if the new nation takes those athletes in. So the question becomes about whether, so since the origin nation is not actually forcing players to stay, the argument is actually that you increase the cost on the new nation of taking those players. So the question is about what is the change then? Is that cost so prohibitive that a lot of players that otherwise would have been taken by those teams are not going to be taken by those teams? And I think side negatives approach to this point is to say that you force players to stay or you deter players from leaving. And I think that framing there means that they are not able to get into the analysis of how expensive this is going to be for richer nations and what that trade-off is going to be there for when they are compensating a country for a certain player versus doing other things with that money. It's unclear as to how much money that this is compared to like the amount of money that a rich nation has. And so I'm broadly convinced, as side affirming says, again, maybe not mechanized as much, but says that rich players have money, want to win, and therefore if the player is good enough, they're likely to pay for that player. So I'm convinced that a large amount of those players who would be going there for free anyway are likely going to be the new nation is likely going to compensate the origin nation, and there isn't necessarily this restriction on a lot of those players. But even to the extent in the best case for side negative on this point, because I might be convinced to a certain extent that there might be a limit to how much compensation happens, and some athletes might not get to play for the new nation. That way up there, I think, is because of the scale problems I talked about in terms of I'm not sure how much this deters new nations from compensation and therefore taking in players, is a group of individuals who are good at that sport. And the trade-off for those individuals is they don't get to play in the highest level of national sports in their new nation compared to a vast group of individuals who now get to play sports at all and have that grassroots element that I think is impacted by both teams as being very useful. So it's close, but I think that on that level of scale and impacting on different types of athletes, it's a much better change based on side affirming having proven the incentive to develop grassroots level sports and providing those opportunities for a lot of people within that origin nation that outweighs even some of those athletes that may no longer be taken by a new richer country because of that extra level of compensation, which again is a smaller number that is claimed by side negative. and I think has a smaller level of harm that isn't necessarily impacted as well as the ability to flourish and play a sport in general. And because of that, when close margin, we gave this debate to side affirmative.